Hello, very beautiful community. As the war is becoming more dramatic on both Russian soil and Ukrainian soil, there's a bit of a political crisis in Ukraine. So let's say a couple of words about that from a big picture perspective. Mr. Fedorov, the ex-defense minister, released an explosive YouTube video in which he essentially pressed 2 points: that Ukraine should have elections, and he said we can't outsource to the Russians the question of whether we should or shouldn't have elections. Our democracy shouldn't be in the hands of the Kremlin. And the second thing he pressed is a point about the extent of corruption in Ukraine and how far that is creating a crisis of governance in the country. Meanwhile, Mr. Khamara, the next defense minister, is in post, and many people are hoping that he can continue doing some of the positive things Mr. Fedorov was doing. And the Ukrainian anti-corruption agencies have released wiretaps, which they say justify raids on various public officials. And today, Mr. Zelensky fired Irina Mudra, the second person, the deputy chief of the presidential office. So what's our big picture take in response to all of this? Now, it's very important that I'm not gonna give you a level of granularity about this that I'd give you if we were talking about the Kremlin or the UK for that matter, because it would be unethical for me to drop the quality of the analysis I offer you, which is what would happen. So it's something I follow. I'm in touch with folks in Ukraine about what's going on, but it's important that I engage in this ethical boundary, right, of where the range of application of quality analysis is there for me and where it isn't. So I'm going to say a few big picture things. The first thing you've got to understand emotionally when you hear any news about politics in Ukraine is that you've got to be empathetic toward the fact that politics is 10 times more difficult for them and the conditions of a war they didn't cause. So start with that empathy. The second thing you've got to understand is that it's entirely right for Ukrainians to ask ongoingly, is something that my government is doing about their sustenance of power? Or is it about their sense of the sustenance of the country into the future? Right? And they're entirely right to raise alarm bells when there's balance and swinging too much in the wrong direction. And it is into that kind of question that Mr. Fedorov's remarks feed in. Is this a government that's about the sustenance of the country's future, or has it become too much about the sustenance of its own power? The trouble with that important question, and legitimate question, is it can be directed back at Mr. Fedorov. Is Mr. Fedorov's intervention about the sustenance of Ukraine into the future? Or is it too much about the sustenance of Mr. Fedorov's political self-advancement? So what big picture-wise can we say about the election point and the corruption point? Well, as a political philosopher, I can remind you of what you already know, which is that this is a conflict between two very basic values, even though we might not be exactly sure what they are. But it's something like, on the one hand, democratic accountability, and on the other hand, unity or stability of governance at wartime. The conflict is tragic in the sense that there is real loss whatever you do. You can't win with it, but what you want to do is lose less badly with the conflict. So there is absolutely no question that the need for Ukraine to have elections is very great. And the desire for Ukrainians to have an election is entirely appropriate. At the same time, there's also huge room for the appropriateness of a desire to not have an election because of the difficulties and risks entailed. it's going to require legal and constitutional adaptation, huge number of problems being solved, some of which I can't even think of. Some of the obvious ones we can think of are, what are we going to do with the people who are fighting? What are we going to do with the people on the occupied territory? What are we going to do with the people who have left the country? And none of that means you can't do it, but it does mean it would have to come with very significant democratic deficit and very significant risks. So I'm going to leave it to country experts to adjudicate that further, but I'll just tell you one thing, and that's that if you woke up Mr. Putin in the middle of the night and told him Ukraine is having an election, he'd think he's had the best day of the year. That doesn't mean you can't do it, but it means that that's an important factor to consider. On the point of corruption, let me just make one very loose and big picture observation. When you gain power as a political leader in a country with weak and fragile and corrupt institutions, the tendency is to organize power along personalist lines. That's to say, the tendency is to drift toward a somewhat mafia-like conception of human resources and recruitment, and break down people into those you trust and those you don't trust, and those you trust are those you personally know. Now, that makes you run the country a bit more easily, but it certainly doesn't solve the initial problem, and indeed it often makes it worse. So it's that kind of challenge that Zelensky is stuck in. And of course, being stuck in it at wartime makes it much more difficult. What I would finally say, big picture-wise, is that this is now nearly 5 years of full-scale war. And the longer the full-scale war goes, the more you're going to see politicization and overt conflict on the Ukrainian political scene. And all we can do from the outside is wish them well with it and hope that as much of that conflict is constructive rather than toxic and destructive for their political system, because that's what Putin would want. A bit slower today for health reasons, beautiful community, but lots of love and talk to you very soon.